I should have known something was off when Sarah mentioned the Ouija board. It wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, something so reckless. But there we were, in the old house on the outskirts of town, the house that everyone swore was haunted. I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. After all, I had grown up with logic, science, facts. Ghosts and spirits? That was for children or people who had too much time on their hands. But Sarah insisted. She always had a way of convincing people to do things they'd never normally do. "Come on, Matt. It'll be fun. We're just asking questions." "No harm in that," she said, smirking like she knew something I didn't. She laid the board on the floor, candles flickering around us, the air thick with tension, and the room lit only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracked window. It was a Friday night. The others, Tom, Rebecca, and Jake, sat around us, watching intently, waiting for the first sign of movement. I remember their faces, eyes wide with excitement, but I didn't share that same feeling. There was something about the way Sarah's hand hovered over the planchette that unsettled me. It wasn't like her usual mischievous grin. It was almost like she was waiting for something more than just an answer. "Is anyone here?" Sarah whispered, her voice too quiet, as if she feared someone might overhear. We all held our breath, staring at the planchette. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then it moved. Not much, just a slight twitch, like a soft breeze had brushed it. But it was enough to make my stomach drop. The planchette slowly drifted toward the letter Y. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice calm, as though she hadn't just made contact with something that should not have been contacted. I wasn't sure if it was the group's collective energy or the chill that suddenly hung in the air, but it felt wrong. And yet, nobody stood up. Nobody said, "Let's stop." Everyone was too fascinated. Sarah's fingers tightened around the planchette. "Who are you?" This time, the movement was more pronounced. The planchette flew across the board, spelling out a name. "Evelyn." A cold laugh escaped from Sarah's lips. "Evelyn. Huh? Is that your name?" The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. But then, a sound, soft at first, like a whisper, crawled from the corner of the room. A low, almost inaudible murmur, but distinct enough to send a shiver up my spine. "Matt," a voice hissed. My heart raced. It wasn't anyone in the room. I was sure of that. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Everyone nodded, but nobody moved. We all felt it. The air had thickened. The tension had become a tangible thing, clinging to our skin, crawling under our nails. But no one seemed to care. They were waiting for something more. And that's when things started to change. The room grew darker with every passing second. It wasn't just the lack of light. It was as though the darkness was alive, creeping into the corners, suffocating the space. I could hear every breath, every shift of weight. But it was what I didn't hear that scared me the most. The whispers had stopped. The sound of our breathing was suddenly too loud, too real. Then the planchette moved again. This time it didn't slide slowly. It jerked violently, as if something unseen had grabbed hold of it. It spelled out a message that made my stomach twist. "Get out!" I felt a cold sweat break out across my neck. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I glanced around at the others, their faces pale, their eyes wide, but no one was reaching to stop it. Not even Sarah, whose hand still hovered above the planchette. They were all frozen in place, transfixed. Okay, maybe that's enough," I said, trying to sound casual, but the words didn't come out right. My voice cracked, betraying my fear. "Don't be such a baby, Matt," Sarah chuckled, though her voice sounded strangely forced. She looked at the board again, her eyes narrowing. "Let's ask it more questions." Something was not right. I should have stood up then, told them we were done, but I couldn't bring myself to move. It was as if my body had been paralyzed, tethered to the floor by something I couldn't see. Then the planchette moved again, faster this time, as if it was being dragged across the surface. "Who is Evelyn?" Sarah whispered, but her tone was different now. not playful, not mocking. It was almost pleading. The planchette shot to the letters F-O-R-E-V-E-R. The room seemed to shake. I could feel it in my bones, the vibration, the unnatural force pushing against us. It wasn't a subtle change. It was violent, like the air had become dense with an unbearable weight. I tried to lift my hand from the board, but it was as if an invisible force was holding me down. My skin felt raw, like it was burning. I looked around again. Jake's face was twisted in confusion. Tom had turned pale, and Rebecca looked like she was about to faint. And then there was Sarah, her eyes now wide, locked onto the planchette with a mixture of terror and anticipation. She wasn't even blinking. "Sarah, let it go. Please," I begged. My voice sounded distant, like it was coming from another world. But she didn't listen. She continued, her voice trembling. "Evelyn, are you still here?" The room became so cold I could see the air itself crackle with frost. The lights flickered, and I swore I saw shadows move across the walls. Not human shapes, but something else, something wrong. Then the voice came again. "Matt." It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't anyone's voice. It was a voice I hadn't heard before, and yet it was so close, so real. It seemed to come from within my own mind. The voice sounded almost pleased. I looked at the others, and their faces were stricken with terror. They were no longer paying attention to the board. They were looking at me. Their eyes were wide, pleading, as if they could see something I couldn't. "Matt, look behind you." I froze, my blood turning to ice. Slowly, my head turned. The air felt suffocating, as if I were being dragged into the void. Behind me, the shadow of a figure moved. It was a silhouette at first, nothing more than a vague outline. But then the details started to form. I saw long, matted hair, hanging loosely over a face I couldn't quite make out. But what I did see, or rather what I felt, was pure malice. The air around it seemed to bend and distort. It was no longer just a shadow. It was alive. I wanted to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure loomed closer, its breath hot against my skin. And then I heard the laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was wrong, deep and guttural, filled with a sinister, knowing joy. I had no time to react. The world seemed to crack, and in that split second of terror, everything stopped. The room went silent, and then the figure was gone. But something had changed. Something had followed us. The silence that followed was worse than the screams, the whispers, the shadows. It was suffocating, a quiet that clung to the edges of my mind and threatened to crush it. My heart hammered against my ribs as I slowly turned back to the group, each of them staring at me, eyes wide with terror. "What was that?" Jake's voice barely broke through the stillness, hoarse and trembling. "I don't know," I stammered, trying to steady my breath, but every part of me was shaking. I felt as though I had narrowly escaped some invisible hand that had reached into the very core of my being. And yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't left. The board lay before us, still, its eerie calm a stark contrast to the storm of emotions flooding my mind. The planchette had stopped moving, but the unease in the room was palpable, like the air was thick with a presence, something that had crossed over with us, into our world. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Rebecca muttered, her voice shaking as she backed away from the board. But she wasn't convincing anyone, least of all herself. Her eyes kept darting to the dark corners of the room, as if expecting something to materialize from the shadows. "We need to get rid of it now," I said, my voice shaking, but with more conviction this time. I felt like I was being watched, as if something, or someone, was waiting for me to make a mistake, to slip up. Tom nodded slowly, his face drained of color. "Yeah, let's get this out of here." We all agreed, but none of us dared to touch the board again. Sarah, who had been the one to start all of this, had a look in her eyes I didn't recognize. It wasn't the playful glint I was used to. It was a mixture of fear and something else. She reached forward, her hand trembling as she grabbed the edge of the board. "I'll put it away," she whispered, almost to herself. She stood up, eyes locked on the dark corners of the room as if she expected something to move. I stood, too, following her toward the door, but my legs felt like lead. As Sarah carried the Ouija board out into the hall, the rest of us trailed behind, but the moment we stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped further. I could see my breath, but it wasn't from the cold. It was from the suffocating weight of something else in the air. "Sarah, hurry up," I said, trying to sound calm, though my voice was barely more than a whisper. She didn't respond. She just kept walking, her pace increasing, until she reached the front door and stepped outside. The rest of us followed, but as we crossed the threshold, a sudden, deafening crash echoed behind us. We all froze. My heart pounded in my ears as I looked back toward the doorway. The front door had slammed shut, but the worst part wasn't the noise. It was the reflection in the glass. A figure stood behind us, its outline jagged, as though it were made of shattered glass itself. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with thin, elongated limbs that reached toward us. I couldn't make out its face, but I knew it was there, watching. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. We all ran. We didn't even stop to think. We just ran, stumbling over each other, desperate to escape the nightmare that had followed us. We didn't stop until we reached my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the house. In the distance, I could still see that figure in the window, standing perfectly still, as if it was waiting for something, for me. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just the house that was haunted. It was me. We made it back to Sarah's apartment later that night. She insisted we all sleep in the same room, and we did because no one could bear the thought of being alone. The rest of the night was quiet, but I knew the silence was just the calm before the storm. And then, at around 3 a.m., I heard it. The whisper. "Matt." I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The others were still asleep, but I couldn't ignore it. It was the same voice I had heard before. But it wasn't just in my head this time. It was in the room, with us. I grabbed my phone, heart racing, trying to dial someone, anyone. But when I looked at the screen, the only message was from Sarah. "She's here. It won't stop until we finish what we started." And then my phone went dead. Couldn't breathe. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. Sarah's message, "She's here. It won't stop until we finish what we started," kept repeating in my mind. I stared at the blank screen of my phone, hoping it would magically come to life again. But it didn't. I turned to the others, but none of them were awake. They were still locked in their restless sleep, but I knew, deep down, that they weren't safe. None of us were. Not anymore. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me. The whispers had stopped, but the presence in the room felt heavier, more oppressive. It was like something invisible was pressing down on my chest, squeezing the life out of me. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still asleep on the floor, her face pale and drawn, her eyes twitching under closed lids. That's when I heard it again. "Matt." This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a voice, clear, alarming, and it came from right behind me. I spun around, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. But there was no one there. The room was empty. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls, the flickering light of the street lamp outside casting twisted, contorted shapes through the curtains. My breath came in short, sharp gasps. I needed to wake them. I needed to get them out of here before whatever had been following us caught up. But as I moved toward the others, a low groan escaped from the corner of the room. I turned, my body frozen in place as my eyes adjusted to the dark. There, in the farthest corner of the room, standing motionless, was the same figure I had seen in the reflection of the glass. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was solid enough for me to make out its twisted features. Its limbs were too long, stretching impossibly thin, its fingers curled into claws. And its face. Its face was a distorted mask of pale, dead skin, eyes black as night, and a mouth that stretched into a grin so wide it shouldn't have been able to exist. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I was paralyzed, locked in place by the sheer terror that radiated from the figure. It felt like time had stopped, and all that remained was the monster in front of me. It didn't move toward me, but I knew it was watching, waiting. "Matt." This time, the voice came from behind me, soft, seductive. It was Evelyn's voice, the same name that had come from the board. But it wasn't her, not really. I knew that. I felt it in my gut. I turned slowly, my heart racing, to find Sarah standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't just fear in her gaze. There was something else. A strange look, like she wasn't fully herself anymore. Her lips trembled, and she whispered, It's coming for us." The room grew colder again, the temperature dropping rapidly. The shadows stretched further, encroaching on us like a flood, as if the darkness itself was alive, and it was swallowing everything in its path. I reached for Sarah, but she didn't move. She stood frozen in place, eyes locked on the figure in the corner. And then, just as I stepped closer to her, I heard the voice again. "Matt," it hissed. "It's too late. You can't escape." The figure in the corner twitched. Its hand moved slowly toward its mouth, and with a sickening sound, it peeled its lips back, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. It grinned. The grin stretched wider, too wide for any human face to manage. The lights flickered, and in that instant, I saw what it truly was. It wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just a person. It was something else. Something from the other side. Something that should never have crossed over. And as it stepped forward, I realized with gut-wrenching certainty, it was Evelyn, or at least whatever had taken her. I turned to Sarah, desperate, pleading, but her expression had changed. It was no longer the face of a friend, of someone I knew. It was the same twisted, empty face of the thing in the corner. Her mouth twisted into that same grin. "No," I shouted. "Sarah, snap out of it." But it was too late. With a sickening crack, her body snapped backward as if an invisible force had pulled her. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head, and she let out a low, guttural growl, a noise that couldn't possibly come from a human throat. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. My mind raced, trying to find a way out. But there was no escape. The air had become thick, oppressive. The door was gone. The windows were covered in blackness. The figure in the corner was moving closer, its eyes locked on me. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get out, but my legs wouldn't move. My body wouldn't obey. I was trapped. Suddenly, I heard the sound of glass shattering. The windows, which I thought were covered, burst open, sending shards of glass across the room. The cold night air rushed in, but it wasn't enough to break the hold the figure had on us. It was coming closer now. His footsteps were slow, deliberate. Each step it took, the floor seemed to crack under its weight. The walls seemed to bend, to shift, as if reality itself was warping. Then I heard Sarah's voice again. But it wasn't her. It wasn't Sarah. "Matt, you'll join us soon." And then the thing lunged. Time seemed to stop the moment the figure lunged. I felt its presence before I even saw it move. The air thickened, and an unnatural cold rushed toward me like a wave. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else, but I felt the floor beneath me crack and shift. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat, trapped by the grip of whatever had taken hold of this place. The thing, Evelyn or whatever it had become, was closer now, and its grin stretched impossibly wide as it moved toward me with predatory slowness. I could see its hollow eyes, blacker than midnight, and its thin, grotesque fingers reaching out to grab me. I turned instinctively, and my body finally obeyed. I bolted toward the door, but it wasn't there anymore. The hallway I had once known was now a labyrinth of shifting shadows and empty, stretching walls. Nothing made sense. I was running in circles, feeling the presence of the thing behind me, always there. It was right there. I could hear its breath, a rasping sound like nails dragging across stone. It was closer than ever. The laughter, low, guttural, and unholy, echoed in my ears, reverberating around me like it was coming from every corner of the room. I had to escape. I had to survive. But where could I go? I stumbled, my breath ragged, as I turned back to find a way out. But then I saw something impossible. The figure was right in front of me, standing in the doorway, its limbs stretched impossibly long, curling toward me. Its hand reached out with lightning speed, gripping my wrist so tightly that I could feel the bones beneath my skin creak. I tried to pull away, but it was too strong. I felt like I was being dragged into the darkness, pulled into the void that seemed to grow larger with each passing second. "Matt," it whispered, its voice like ice scraping against metal. "You should never have opened the door." The pressure on my wrist was unbearable, but I couldn't break free. The grip was like iron, and its fingers dug into my skin, burning with a cold that made my entire arm go numb. The room seemed to stretch. The walls were closing in, warping around me. I could feel my mind starting to unravel. The shadows were alive now, crawling toward me, reaching out like hungry claws. And then, something inside me snapped. I didn't care anymore. I didn't care if it heard me, if it came for me. With every last ounce of strength, I shouted, "Leave me alone." The words broke through the suffocating silence, and for a moment, the figure faltered. The grip loosened, just enough for me to break free. I didn't waste a second. I spun around and ran faster than I ever had in my life. The darkness seemed to chase me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I burst through the front door, into the cold night air, gasping for breath. The world outside felt different, quieter, calmer, but still tainted by the terror I had just escaped. The streetlights flickered in the distance, but there was no one else on the road. It was just me now, alone. But I wasn't free. I didn't know how, but I knew that whatever had followed me, was still out there, waiting, watching. I could feel its presence pressing on my chest, the weight of it lingering just behind me. I ran until I couldn't feel my legs, my chest tight with panic, but I couldn't stop. By the time I made it to the edge of town, the whispers began again. "Matt," it was distant at first, but it was there. I could feel it, creeping into my mind like a poison, infecting my every thought. I knew I wasn't safe. I didn't know what happened to Sarah. I didn't know what happened to the others. But I knew one thing for sure. Once you opened the door, it never closed. Once you invited whatever was on the other side in, it wouldn't just leave. It would never leave. I drove that night, my eyes darting from side to side, certain that if I stopped, if I even dared to blink, it would catch up to me. I drove until I couldn't remember where I was anymore, until the world blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. And then I saw it, a flicker in the rearview mirror, a shadow. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding, as the car skidded to a halt. The reflection in the mirror showed nothing, but I knew what I saw. I knew it was back. That's when I realized the thing that followed us, that Evelyn, wasn't bound by time. It didn't need a Ouija board or a doorway to cross. It was already in my mind, and it wasn't going anywhere. I don't know if I'm going to make it out of this alive. But if you're reading this, if you're still watching, don't ever touch a Ouija board. Because once you call it in, there's no turning back. I wish I could say that everything returned to normal after that night, that I managed to escape, that I outran whatever followed me. But I can't. Everywhere I went, it was there. In the shadows, in the corners of my vision. The whispers never stopped. The darkness lingered, always pressing, always watching. I could feel it like a weight on my chest. A heavy, suffocating presence that I couldn't escape. No matter how far I ran, no matter how much I tried to hide, it found me. It knew me, and it was always there. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe it was the stress, the fear of what had happened. But then, one night, it happened again. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. The air was thick, suffocating. I could hear it, that voice, low and cold, coming from the corner of my room. "Matt," I froze, staring into the darkness. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to acknowledge it. But I knew it was there. The shadows in the corner of the room twisted. They shifted and curled, and for a moment I saw it, the figure, Evelyn, or what had become of her. Its eyes were still black as night, its limbs too long, too thin. It reached toward me with one outstretched arm, its fingers curling like claws, and I could hear its laughter, low and guttural, echoing in my ears. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in the suffocating grip of terror. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then, it spoke again, its voice thick with malice. "You should have finished it when you had the chance, Matt. You invited me in, and now you belong to me." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I had tried to ignore it. I had tried to deny it, but deep down I knew. I knew that it had never left. It had followed me, attached itself to me like a curse. I could feel its presence in my mind, worming its way into my thoughts. The darkness, the cold, the whispers. I thought of Sarah, of Tom, of Rebecca. I wondered what had happened to them. Had they survived? Or had they, too, become a part of the thing that had taken over that house? I didn't know. I never found out. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't escape. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing against my skin, and for the briefest moment, I felt it. That ice-cold, suffocating grip. It wasn't just physical. It was inside me, deep within me, taking hold. And then I heard it. "Matt, come to me." The voice was sweet now, a whisper of promises, a call to surrender. It wasn't just Evelyn anymore. It was everything. The house, the shadows, the darkness that had followed me all this time. It was in me now, part of me, and there was no escaping it. I had been warned. We all had, but it was too late. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the laughter. That terrible, bone-chilling laughter that I had heard too many times before. And then nothing. I don't know where I am now. I don't know what's real or what's left of me. Maybe I'm still here, trapped in some twisted version of reality. Maybe I'm not. But one thing's for certain, this story, my story, is a warning. Do not play with Ouija boards. Do not invite what you cannot see, what you cannot understand, into your life. Because once you do, once you open that door, there is no going back. And if you ever hear the whisper of your name in the dark, don't answer. It's already too late.